And so know that if you have your face or your camera showing, or if you speak, that you will be recorded as part of our recording that we'll put up for folks after this is over. We're going to start with a quick poll to see which topics are of most importance to you today. Betsey's going to launch the poll for me. And we'll give you a minute to respond. Take a minute or two. And then actually, Betsey, I should probably stop sharing so that you can show the poll results.
Yeah. Okay, can you see it now?
I can't.
I'm due responses.
Okay, yep.
And I have responses. I'm going to end that. And I'm going to share results. Can you see the results, Kim? So we have about 33% continue the conversation about supporting learners in remote hybrid learning. 50% get ideas for facilitating collaborative conversations with learners about the effectiveness of strategies. We're tied at 17% for get tips for monitoring effectiveness of strategies and adjusting them as needed, and getting ideas to help learners build self-awareness. And then 33% for share experiences and hear what's working for others.
Excellent. Very good. And so far, we're a small, cozy group, so you should be able to share a lot with each other. So wonderful. All right, I'll go back to sharing the video and we'll get going. Not the video, the PowerPoint. Okay. So NDFL is a conceptual framework that is based on the idea that learning is just what the brain does. That's who we are. The All Kinds of Minds NeuroDevelopmental Framework for Learning is a framework and a vocabulary. It's something you can use all the time to describe learners and learning. And our goal is for this to be a habit of mind. At the center of our NDFL work is a premise that the brain is what learning does, and we are all good learners. We have 4 guiding principles. We are all learners with aspirations and passions which deserve to be supported in every way possible. Learning changes lives by helping us develop the will, knowledge, skill, and capacity to achieve our aspirations. Learning needs to happen in different ways, so we use various strengths and resources to engage with the world around us. And learning empowers us to co-create our public world and to shape the decisions that impact our lives. These 4 guiding principles are operationalized through 5 actions. Inspire optimism in the face of learning challenges, discover and treasure unique learning profiles, eliminate humiliation, blaming, and labeling of students, empower students to find success, and leverage strengths and affinities. As mentioned, the NDFL is a conceptual framework for organizing the mental processes of learning into 8 constructs. These include attention, higher order cognition, language, memory, neuromotor functions, social cognition, temporal sequential thinking, and visual spatial thinking. Our first webinar focused on the importance of observation, and we summarized that up in the following tips. When observing, we should find and focus on our children's strengths. Pay attention to body language. It tells us a lot about how they're feeling. Ask questions. It takes some practice, but we have to not tell our own story about what we're seeing, but find out what the learner's story is. Listen and listen more. even if they're not ready to describe what they need, we have to help build the language for them to do that. And embark on a path of discovery together. There's no right answer. Our second webinar focused on identifying strategies. Paul is going to give us a recap about the case study that he shared.
Last time we spoke about Olivia, who was an 8th grader who in the early grades had some reading delays, but things seemed to settle down and things seemed to be going well until she got to middle school. And her teachers made the observation that whenever they gave instruction, she was talking to her neighbors and raised concerns about attention. When they moved to remote learning after the pandemic began, mom and dad noticed she was confused by verbal instructions, seemed to really get confused by vocabulary words in math, had difficulty understanding even concept words like democracy. And so they were concerned about whether or not she was actually understanding. So we looked at that information and developed 2 hypotheses applying the NeuroDevelopmental Framework of the 2 constructs that we thought were in play. And one was attention and the other was language. And based on those hypotheses, we generated, one hypothesis was attention, her challenge. And that was why she was sort of looking around and talking to her friends. And the second hypothesis was language the challenge. And as we worked toward our thinking, we then identified some strategies that we could use. Sort of taking advantage of Zoom and distance learning, we decided that we could actually use the chat or a private conversation to front load academic content and give her some of the information or language in advance, and also provide some visual supports to support that front loading. So question for you to ponder is, you've identified some possible concerns, you've made you've put in place some strategies. So now what are you going to look for to decide whether it's working? And what does it look like to know if something's working?
So now we'd like to get your ideas. There's a link here, a small link, that will take you to a Padlet. If you copy and paste, and Betsey's going to put that link in the chat also, so you can click on it from the chat box. And that will take you to the Padlet. I'm going to shift my screen over to that and show you what that looks like. And this is live, so you can go in here and just click anywhere on the screen and add an idea. So what things do you think it's important to pay attention to while you're observing the learner's use of strategies? Are people able to get to this Padlet okay? What we'd like to do is collect your ideas. We're going to do this a few times through this session, and then we'll send you out all of the ideas that get posted here after the session. So if you go in and you say, idea, ask questions. Oops. For some reason I got kicked off. Okay, that's my, I'll be right back on. That's my internet, folks. All right, better? All right, great. Oh, that's a good one. Changes in the number of meltdowns. Duration of apparently low stress engaged time. Can we get a couple more ideas up there? Yeah, do they need additional directions in understanding what is expected? In body language and facial expressions, does she appear more engaged? These are actually pointing us toward our update. So please feel free to keep adding ideas here. That's great. I see more coming in. As I said, we're going to collect all of these and send them back out to you afterward. The Padlet is still live. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. And Paul's going to give us an update. We're going to check back in with Olivia. She's been paying attention to her strategies. Paul's been using some of our observation tips and tricks, and so have her parents, by the way. And this is what's going on.
Well, we were all excited. We thought we had this nailed and we had this great strategy. And all your suggestions point to exactly what we did and what we saw. She still looked really confused and disengaged at times and was sort of checking out. And so we were sort of left at this moment of confusion, right? Which is to say, you know, and so often when people get in this situation, their first reaction is we tried it and it didn't work. And we were convinced that we were onto the right ideas. I mean, we had thought this through. Why wasn't it working? And we sort of brainstormed with Olivia a little bit and talked things through with her. And she said, you know, she was still really confused. And as we talked to her, we realized that she was getting the instructions from us, but she didn't know what to do with them. And we tried some different tactics together through trial and error. And in working with her, we realized that she needed more than just getting the information in advance. She actually needed it to be broken down into a bulleted list with small manageable chunks. She was still overwhelmed by what we were providing to her. And we had thought it through in our own minds, but we didn't know how Olivia was going to process it. And then the other thing we realized was that she had to say it back to us, that she had to put it in her own words and break it down into chunks. And that once we talked that through with her, she knew what to do. And in fact, we began to realize that as we were front loading her, we could see her body language. And sometimes she still looked stressed. But what began to happen more and more was that sometimes she would take what we gave her and break it into chunks herself and put it into bullet forms. Or sometimes she'd turn to us and say, I'm still confused. I don't know what you're talking about. And she suddenly felt empowered to look at, recognize when she was having stress. She stopped shutting down so much, in fact, and began to when she was feeling stressed, she would direct message us back and say, you know, hey guys, slow down, I'm lost here. And suddenly things started to fall into place.
I think one of the key points, I'm just going to say it again because Paul said it in the beginning there, is that we didn't stop and say this isn't working. We said, why isn't this working? And had a conversation with her. So it's really important that we not give up on the strategy early. I think it's worth mentioning too, that because we came up with a strategy based on our thoughtful observations and Olivia's profile, we weren't just shooting in the dark. there was good reason to think that something along these lines would work. The problem was that we had to back up a bit and do two things. We had to start simpler, and we had to collaborate so that the strategy became Olivia's. And basically, this is the dance around the does it work dialogue. Based on our belief that everyone is a good learner, this is a continuous process of observing, discussing, and adjusting, all with the learner through the collaborative dialogue. And we want to break down this does it work dialogue, as we call it, into three key elements: ongoing observation, collaborative dialogue, and developing self-awareness and agency. For me, I think one of the most powerful things about Olivia's story is that it progressed from us recognizing that we needed to do something for Olivia to Olivia recognizing when she was feeling overwhelmed, when she was feeling stressed, and that she became able to figure out for herself what she needed to do. And as she did that, our strategies became more effective, and it became a partnership together. And that's really where we want to go. We don't want to always be doing it for our learners. We want to help them develop that capacity. So I'm going to kick this over to Betsey now to give us some tips for observation.
Hi. Our first core element of observation, one of the first things you should do is watch and pay attention without attributing our meaning before asking what it means to them. So in a way, we don't lead them into the answer, see if they can tell us what's going on with them. Then we need to listen to what the child is saying, attend to verbal cues, not interpreting what they say as being lazy. Keep emotional content in mind, have to know when to not take it at face value. Children will try to shield themselves from embarrassment. It could be seen as disrespectful, not caring, lazy, refusing, but what is behind those behaviors? So get to know exactly what's behind those behaviors and what they may be hiding. Collect data. Is there a decrease in frequency? Are there increasing successes? Use that data to help inform you on how the strategy is going. Stay curious. What do the behaviors and action mean to the child? Remember, a hypothesis is not a diagnosis. And in remote environments, using reactions in Zoom and having polls that use emojis and emojis for emotions works wonders. I use it often with my 5 to 7 year olds. So it really works. At this time, we're going to give you an opportunity to share tips that you think can help with observation. We're going to go back to the board that we were at earlier with Paul, and I will put that back in the link again, just in case you, back in the chat, just in case you closed it, and just give us a couple of ideas that you know, tips that you have about observation.
So the pink stickies are the prompt. So this one is what to look for. What are things to keep in mind while observing? And we're looking for your ideas. So your newest sticky will show up as on the top. So if you keep adding, those will show up above these others. Building on a couple of the earlier posts, how can you tell a meltdown's coming before the meltdown arrives? What kinds of things do you look for?
These are wonderful ideas. I know a lot of people have to maybe have a little reflection time. So we're going to, please feel free throughout the rest of the webinar is if you think of anything, just go right back and start adding to it, because we will be collecting these and sending it to everyone after the webinar is over.
Yeah, and you can like an idea. So if you see an idea here that you think, oh yeah, they said what I was going to say, or I completely agree with that, give it a little love there with a heart. Okay. There's some great pieces coming in here. I really like the observation that to be able to say I still don't get it is dependent on trusting that something useful is going to come out of saying that. I think that's really important. And I'm going to take us back to the slideshow because I think that points to our next part of this session, which is the collaborative dialogue. And I think that that is a place where we have the opportunity to build that trust and to build that relationship. So here are a few tips for a collaborative dialogue. And just to let you know, we're going to ask you again for your tips. So be thinking about what's missing here while I go through these, or how you might elaborate on some of the ideas here. So the first thing that we think is important is to check our assumptions. Never assume that the child doesn't care. My number one conversation, I think, with colleagues and parents that I work with, is because I work a lot with high school, is he's just lazy. And I have to say, put that on pause. Put lazy aside for a minute. What might be going on that looks like lazy? Never assume that the child doesn't care. And also avoid the I tried it, it didn't work, it really is the kid scenario. Everybody wants to be successful. Nobody is looking forward to being a failure, especially not over and over again. Collecting data is a really important piece of this. Once you have a strategy in mind and you start testing it, this is a very vulnerable moment. A decrease isn't a cure. But if something's decreased from 10 times a morning to 7 times a morning, that's a 30% improvement. That's pretty good. So we want to watch for those small increments of change, and we want to celebrate them, and help the learner see, look, this is getting better. What can we learn from this, and how can we build on that? Monitor the student to adult voice ratio. Again, this is a fragile time. You're building the student's ability to express what's going on for them. I'm going to go back to that post that we saw on the Padlet that said to be able to say something is to trust that it's going to be useful, that it's going to make a difference, that it's going to be listened to and heard. So really paying attention to what the child is saying, or the learner, because it may not be a child, and their ability to express what's happening for them is important, in building their capacity for that. And that's where developing shared language can come in. This can be really helpful if you have some ways to talk about what's happening. The learner sketch tool that we went over in the last session, and we'll put the link up at the end of this session, can be a great place to start because it's a third point of reference. It builds the learner's profile, and most importantly, focus on the strengths first. So use the strengths to build that trust in the relationship to start the conversation around how can we help with some of the challenges. Prioritizing open-ended questions is really helpful too. Using fewer statements, because we might just be repeating our own story as opposed to finding out what their story is. Relationship and trust, they get built through these open-ended questions and through that listening piece. And of course, pay attention to nonverbal cues, especially signs of embarrassment. The I don't know is often a way of covering and some kind of protective behavior. It's also a way of saying, I don't know how to express what's going on for myself yet, what's going on for me yet. So that's where sometimes the emojis come in and are helpful. In fact, one of Paul's observations has been that you can see a lot more sometimes through remote context than you do in person, because there's less of a sense of being, I don't know, watched by everybody. And these days, you don't have a mask on in remote, but you might in face-to-face. So I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Paul, how the remote context can sometimes give you more opportunities for observation.
I think that it's been fascinating to me that there are pluses and minuses in all of the settings. Look, I'd much rather be face-to-face and in a room with the student, but these days, quite often when we're with students face-to-face, we're all wearing masks. The other thing is that in a classroom, you can't direct message a student without the whole class seeing it. And teachers are talking to me about how they've been able to direct message students. I had a child psychologist who, and I know a lot of psychologists having difficulty. She told me that the kid that she's with takes her into her hiding place. And so she's getting a window into the child's life or the child's room that we don't always see. Of course, sometimes kids are embarrassed. And that's the other point, is that they won't have their camera on because they're embarrassed about where they are or what things look like. But I think that there are, things that you can see in remote learning that you might not always be able to see in the classroom, or even to focus on that individual child. So I'm not saying it's much worse. There's no getting around it, but there are some things that you can, that it allows us to do that has opened up some interesting vistas, I think.
Thanks, Paul. So it's time again. Let's get some of your ideas about how we engage the learner in reflecting on and adjusting strategies. We're going to go back to the Padlet. You must be getting to be old hand at this now. So the newest prompt is over here on the left. Oh, great. Yeah, Ross Green's work is really helpful. Ross Green's work dovetails really well with the All Kinds of Minds. There's a lot of overlap, and the premises are the same, that we all want to be successful. Nobody wants to fail. And the basic premise that people do well if they can is really key. We're a small group and there's plenty of time. So if you want to talk while you're posting, please feel free to chime in.
I love the one about a safe space. That's going to be key throughout the whole process. You're on mute, Kim.
That's really helpful, isn't it? Thank you for observing that. Okay, so I was observing what great ideas are up there, and say keep your Padlet going. Saying keep your Padlet going. We're going to move forward. I'm going to give it back to Betsey here to talk about developing self-awareness and agency.
Yeah. So in talking about developing self-awareness and agency, this is going to be where we're going to have to try to help build the learner's ability to do things. So the first is recognize and interpret their emotions. They are indicators or signposts of struggle. So, you know, certain things we think that maybe we don't pay much attention to, like laying around or something like that. And those emotions, they won't say it because they don't have the words. And it could be a sign for us to help them start talking about that and why they may be doing it. Identifying strategies to help navigate through those emotions, even before they have words for what is going on. And that goes back to us seeing it and try to help them talk through it. Say it in their own words. That's huge. My son, he had a problem with saying it in his own words, and so he didn't catch on to what he needed to be aware of. And so when I started having him, and he started out writing it because he was comfortable writing it, and so get them to the point where they can say it. Once they say it, it becomes more concrete to them. Try and refine strategies they come up with, and reflect on the effectiveness of the strategy so they become self-monitoring and adjusting. We're going to go back to the Jamboard again, and we're going to let you think about what are things that you think we can use to help the learner develop self-awareness.
Before we do, I just want to underscore something you said at the beginning, Betsey, because I think it's so telling. You said they may be laying around, and we can so easily interpret that as laziness, or and it may be disengagement. But there's also some research that body positioning is an indication of internal stress, and the more prone the position, especially during a period that should be active, the more an indication of some kind of internal distress. So when a kid's supposed to be up and doing something, and you can actually see this in the pictures of Olivia, she becomes like, she gets so she's laying down on her desk or she's slumping, and we've got kids in high school who will just go totally back, and it's like the supine position, and it's telling us something about what's happening emotionally for them, even if they're not in touch with it and they can't feel what's going on. So that observation piece of the body positioning is really important and useful too. So one more time to Padlet.
So how do we help the learner grow into their own best advocate and strategist? What are some things that we can do? One of the things I've heard some educators talk about is making the kid aware of this profile, like going through helping them see their strengths and see the things they may struggle with. And that helps them try to find things to help them out, like using their strength to help build what they're struggling with. So giving them something about their profile, it gives them a little bit more control over what's going on.
So a lot of really great ideas here and important observations. Hope is so important. Building the pathways to hope, helping build language so that they can ask for clarification when they need it.
Yeah, that reminded me of something we did with Olivia, because I think, as I realized, a part of what helped her learn how to, we did model some language she could use when she was seeking clarification, and she began to use her own language after that.
I think it's really, really important, this piece around communicating that the profile is a starting point. It's not destiny. That's why we call it the learner sketch tool and not the statue or the chiseled in stone portrait. It can change. It's really important. Great ideas. Oh, Thrively. We're really familiar with Thrively, and Joer Pelding is a friend of ours. That's great. Yeah, reflection is a really important tool for building executive functioning too, and self-awareness. Do you mind putting the link in there to Thrive? I think it's just thrively.org, but that way people will have it. It's very helpful. Thrively.com. Thank you. That's good. Excellent. So at this point, we really just want to summarize and open it up. The PowerPoint, we were just going to come back to what are some key takeaways, and back to the does it work dialogue itself. So our initial webinar was identifying through observation and conversation, and then try some strategies, evaluate them. Again, observation is sort of the soup in which all of this takes place, continual observation and collaborative dialogue, and evaluating and reflecting and adjusting. And remembering that a hypothesis is not a diagnosis, and a strategy may work or not work. And even if it does work, it may only work for a while, and it might be time for a new strategy or update something. I think the most rewarding thing I see, or the most rewarding sign of progress, is when a learner comes back and says, well, that worked for a little bit, but it's not working for me now, but I think what I need is. And Betsey's story about her son that we shared in the first webinar is very illustrative of that. You want to say a little about Davian and his writing challenge and the strategy you put in place and his response to you?
Yeah, Davian, he was struggling to put his ideas on paper. He could talk about it all day, but he he couldn't put it on paper. And so I was helping him come up with strategies. And there was like 2 or 3 that we came up with together. And then I started giving him some that I thought was appropriate. And he came back and told me, he was like, Mommy, that sounds like you and Daddy. That doesn't sound like me. And so what he started doing is when he tried the strategies we came up together, he started seeing things that worked better for him. So he came up with, let me reflect at night of what goes on during the day. And so when I started letting him, I stepped back and I started letting him take over. And what he did is he started adjusting all the strategies to fit his individual profile. But I thought it was really funny that he was telling me how certain strategies just sound like it was me and his dad and it wasn't him at all. Yeah.
One of the resources we've mentioned, actually there are a number of resources at this other URL here, and we will send you out a PDF of these slides. So you'll have this link to the resources. That's a Google Doc. Learner Sketch Tool is a resource that we make available for free that enables learners to develop it's a sketch. It's not a diagnostic, but it empowers conversations between the learner and the adults working with them to look at their profile and look at what their strengths are and their challenges. And it does have strategies embedded in there, as well as some tutorials around what is attention and what's involved with memory and language. So you can learn a little bit more about the neurodevelopmental framework there. And then, as always, the Yellin Center for Mind, Brain, and Education blog has some great features and resources available. So we want to make sure that you know about those resources. And basically, we just want to open it up for questions and comments and your thoughts and observations at this point in time. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question or a comment.
Okay, I think that one of the most useful things we can do to help children better is to vividly re-experience being in a vulnerable learning situation ourselves. So one of the classics, which really shows you how much good instructions can be useless, good instructions, is to use your non-dominant hand if trying to teach a physical skill. Something that I think is very relevant, that's analogous to this, is if anybody has the experience of trying to have a conversation in a language that they didn't learn automatically as a child, you figure out right away that a lot of overload is not about intelligence or motivation. It's just your brain has now been doing such high-level processing for so long that you cannot take it in anymore. It's a great one to teach you to slow down and how what you think is a bite-sized piece of information is actually about 15 pieces of information. Another one is if you have friends, family members who are slowly getting a little harder of hearing as they age, notice what works for them and what doesn't. This is all very practical, but it's also a way of not sort of labeling kids as having learning problems that the rest of us never have.
Yeah, I think those are really great examples. Why my mind is blank. Speaking of overload, I'm thinking of a particular. I think it's Rick but he did a lot of training maybe 20 years ago, having adults try things that are not their strengths, so that they could better empathize with what kids were working on, and using your non-dominant hand to write while taking dictation around a task was a really good example of that. So those are beautiful suggestions, Diana. It would be great to capture them in the Padlet for everyone. And this idea that we have to be learners ourselves and that we have to be vulnerable in the work is so important. Paul, I don't know if you want to share your most recent vulnerability situation.
No, I was, you know, I was assessing a child a few weeks back, and I asked him to write the alphabet, and he would, and maybe I'll use the excuse, and I don't think I deserve an excuse, is, he was behind an acrylic screen, we had our masks on, and he's stopping and he's erasing and he's stopping and he's erasing. And it took me a few minutes and I noticed he was crying. And I really felt like I had, and I took him to the room where his mom was, and our assessments are set up so parents are observing everything. I really felt like I had blown it. I'd really sort of put him in a situation where he was humiliated and he felt terrible. I invited him out. I knew he was a ball player, so I took a small basketball in the doctor's office. I took him out into the hall and we had a catch. And we were just throwing the ball back and forth for about 10 or 15 minutes. And I told him that I screwed up and that I was sorry. And he was like, "What do you mean you screwed up?" And I said, "Well, I really, should have known you were having trouble with it. It wasn't just the alphabet. Any idiot." I go, "No, I'm supposed to know when something's tricky and hard for you. And everything's hard for somebody." And I missed the fact that he was tearful as he was writing the alphabet, and he really had significant sequential challenges, and he couldn't remember what letter came next. And there was that moment of fragility where I really felt like I had, I think in an evaluation or when we're teaching kids, shielding them from humiliation is such a critical piece, I believe, of sort of building that trust. And in an evaluation or an assessment, I feel like I have to let a child know that I'm not going to let them, feel terribly. But the assessment went well after that. I was able to rebuild that trust, but I came so close to blowing it, I think. But just realizing at that moment what it must have meant to him. And his mom told me he was just saying, "I'm so stupid. I'm such an idiot. I can't do it." And maybe I learned something in that moment about how badly he felt about himself. But I wished I hadn't let it get to that point. But even in that moment, I guess, is an opportunity to sort of recapture and figure out what's happening. And I think, I knew I had to do something to rebuild trust. And I knew I had to sort of tread lightly around his challenges because he was feeling really badly about them. And I had to pick a choice. I had to pick a task next that he was going to do well. I had to give him a victory after that. But, I was annoyed with myself because I felt like I should have picked up on it before it got to the point where he burst into tears. And I felt like I let it go too far for him to be in pain. But I think we all learn as we go.
But we need to be able to be vulnerable with each other and share stories like that so we can make meaning and we can figure out what did we learn from that experience too. And I think that was speaking to part of what you're saying, Diana, that we need to be vulnerable and we need to be learners as well.
Look, let's look at a kid who had one of the worst cases of ADHD, maybe besides mine, because in the middle of the assessment, he looks up at me and goes, "You really ought to organize your desk better." I looked back and I said, "You're right." But, I think that he was more open to hearing about his own attention challenges, I believe. But I didn't set up my desk to make him feel more comfortable. It was just the way it is, I guess. But I think it is our vulnerabilities and sort of giving them permission, letting them know that we're all humans with them and that, that we don't have all the answers.
I just wanted to share a few years ago, many years ago, I did a workshop for our teachers here at this school, and they were mostly teachers that are not in the program, the Learning Resources program. And so it was something I had learned years before, and I kept it and recreated and added to it. And it was teaching the diverse ways of learning through a made up math language where they had to learn a new alphabet. They had to write with their non-dominant hands. They had to solve equations with the new number system. And it was so eye-opening and all I did was walk around and observe and take note of what they were saying, the teachers. And it was like, oh, I'm so stupid. Oh, this is too difficult. I can't do things with my other hand. This is tiring. And so I would share what they said when we reconvened. But this to them, so many of them said that it made them realize what our kids go through if we don't put ourselves in their shoes. And I hope it lasted with them, but it reminds me maybe I should do it again. We've had new faculty, but it was just a way of realizing all the complexities of learning and really empathizing with from the learner's viewpoint and not always the teacher. So I thought to share that after I think Diana shared her examples. Made me think.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I just wanted to add something with Thrively. If we've adopted it in our program, and the school was so impressed with it that it's going school wide. And the reason we went for it is that it also embodies a portfolio. So a lot of what the kids do, like their strengths assessment, it shows their 5 major strengths, but it doesn't mean because you have strengths, you have necessarily weaknesses. What it says, it shows in a graph what you're more inclined to engage in or use, the strategies you use in learning, but it doesn't mean one is better than the other. So they write about it, they journal, there are playlists that work on developing your strengths, goal setting. They put artifacts in their portfolio. And our kids have become so articulate about who they are, how they learn best, self-advocates. They don't hesitate to come in my office and say, this teacher doesn't understand the way I learn. Will you help me out? So we come up with strategies. They write about it. It's just been, but we've always done that, but this platform has made it come alive. And so I have ongoing workshops just so we deepen our understanding. And there's a big project-based tool that has really resonated well with our students. So I'm excited about it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's excellent. Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
This is a very brilliant group, you're awesome. We have a couple more minutes, so if you have other thoughts, I've been watching the chat too, and I can kind of picture Jennifer and her sister being silly with their piano and modules. But I think it's also telling that you were able to pause it.
Yeah.
You were able to control the speed.
And the other thing, I also got to see how we're both different learners and we were doing this at the same time, but she was processing differently than me. And she'd go, wait a second, no, stop. And she came up with, I can't even repeat the X-rated version of like remembering the keys because she knew she needed a mnemonic. And so that was happening. And I'm kind of more linear. And it was just, as a learning strategist myself, it was like a really good reminder being in that situation of so many things. So I agree. I think it's really important for us to, 2 things, like put ourselves in that new learning situation often. And I really appreciated what you said too, Paul, about being vulnerable. I had a similar situation happen recently, and the good thing is I've already established a relationship with this student, as it sounds like you did. So like sometimes a little fray can happen, but if we're able to catch it and then recalibrate, you know, you can repair things pretty quickly. And I think that's always so important to remember too, but for us to always be just conscious and aware, not afraid to do that.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'd like to add, so I trained as a psychologist before I started doing educational therapy. And something I'm really aware of is that in professional settings, there's a real perception that you'll be penalized for saying, I struggle with this. If you were trained in elite institutions, there's this, I would say, pervasive feeling of having to prove every time that you deserve to be in the room, which is multiplied by a factor of 1,000,000 if you are in a racial, gender, or other category that makes people think people like you don't belong in the room. And I still physical sense of release when over 20 years ago, I went to, I think, the opening talk at All Kinds of Minds. And Dr. Yellin cheerfully mentioned something he doesn't do well and what he does about it. And it was this sort of like this permission. And so I started doing that with my students. I'd say, you are extremely good at that. And one of the reasons I can tell is I have a really hard time with it. You just go like that. By the way, what I do about having a hard time with it is this. And I mentioned this at a professional association meeting, and I was told, it was the first time I'd attended, I was told, that's terrible. Your students cannot possibly have any faith or confidence in you if you say that you have a difficulty with it. And what I said was, I don't see how I'm going to model for them that they can, without any sense of shame, get to learn which kinds of things work or less well for them if I can't talk about myself that way. But so that's just, that's kind of the layer under the layer under the layer. I'm asserting that we have to re-experience vulnerability in learning and qualitatively different kinds of learning ourselves as professionals who have it together and adults who all know how to learn. And so what's underneath that is it has to become something we model and we encourage and we sort of celebrate as a like, hey, yeah, that's a really good thing to notice about yourself. Tell me the ways you use that with your students. Because without that, we all keep going, like, oh yeah, I got it. I can do this. Just my thought.
I was sort of speaking to people that were sort of considering, coming to us for an assessment. And so, and I didn't do enough homework because I didn't look up what this woman did for a living, because she said, well, how do I explain to my son why this, how do you think about all this? And I said, athletes understand learning, the way we sort of think about, you could talk to any athlete on the planet. You could, for example, talk to a tennis player, and any tennis player will say, okay, my forehand's my strong stroke and my backhand's my weak stroke. And she looks at me and she goes, that's interesting. I'm a tennis coach. So I said, I just violated, my first mentor said to me, you never want to talk to an audience who knows more about your subject than you do. So I said, I must have just sounded like a fool. And she said, actually, you don't. She said, Rafael Nadal, who's #1 in the world, has a relatively weak backhand. And anybody who watches him, who knows tennis, will say he hits 80% fewer backhands than the opposition. He'll run around the ball to hit it with his forehand if he can, because he knows he's going to win. So, Diana reminded me of your colleague that if Rafael Nadal didn't know that his backhand was his vulnerability, then somebody else would figure it out. It's not having the vulnerability; it's having one that you don't know about. Same thing with when I work with medical students. and I realized, we've seen about 150, and having a difficulty with attention to detail isn't the fatal flaw if you're a physician. It is if you don't know about it. If you don't know that you are not so good with details, then you got a problem, because, if you confuse 10 milligrams with 1 milligram, that's a huge problem. But if you know that that's your vulnerability and you have a strategy for it, you can be really successful. So, boy, it must be really hard to be in that mind where you feel like you can't ever acknowledge that there's a challenge because nobody will trust you. That's a lot of pressure. Wow.
Well, I just want to thank everybody. This has been a fantastic hour. You've been a great group. We will send you out the link to the recording, the PDF of the PowerPoint, as well as a PDF of the Padlet and everything that you all put in the Padlet. There is the resources document, Google Doc as well. And we hope you'll stay in touch and stay in tune. We love you. We love our community that works in service of learners everywhere and believes, as we do, that we're all great learners. So thank you so much.
Thank you all for sharing your stories and for spending your time with us. Thank you so much.
Oh, and Betsy will send out a little follow-up survey to see how we did too. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diana.
Diana, thank you.
Love your bookshelves, by the way, your bookcases.
Fine, of course.
We have to check in. I want to find out how things are going, but I'll reach out.
Yes, thank you.
Of course.
The answer is lots of new stuff we're processing. So it seemed to make sense to do that before check-in.
Excellent.